You're listening to Washington Watch. I'm Sarah Perry, Director of Partnerships. I am sitting in for Tony Perkins. Well, coming up next, you've heard much about drag queen story hours at schools and libraries, but could you imagine that they are potentially worse than you ever thought? My next guest, John Euler, a clinical counselor, has worked with over 4,000 predators behind bars, and he has an opinion on what they really are. Next. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Sarah Perry, sitting in for Tony Perkins on this Friday afternoon. As a reminder, TonyPerkins.com is where you can find our podcast. I encourage you to go there, visit some of our resources, read on some of our guests, and take the action steps that you find there. Before this next segment, speaking of our podcast, I want to encourage those of you who have small children with you to turn down the volume or press pause and listen to it later tonight, because what we'll talk about next is not appropriate for young ears. Brandon Showalter at the Christian Post wrote an article entitled Drag Queen Story Hour, Greatest Grooming Program Ever Devised, counselor says. And I actually have a chance to talk to that counselor. My next guest, John Euler, a clinical counselor who's worked with over 4,000 serial predators. And he is urging parents to be vigilant after a Texas library hosted a drag queen story hour for kids featuring a reader who had a criminal record. John's a father of 3. He is married to his high school sweetheart who graduated from Epic Bible College, Biola University, with a BA in Christian Education, Talbot School of Theology, where he studied in marriage and family ministries, and California State University, Fullerton, where he earned an MS in counseling. Of all the clinical populations with which he has worked, John's heart and expertise lies with those who wrestle with the effects of trauma, especially trauma resulting from ritualistic sexual abuse. For 11 years, John worked within the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections in a forensic clinical capacity where he spent thousands of hours working within a treatment capacity with the full continuum of sex offenders, including many who were designated as sexually violent predators. Impressively, his in-depth clinical analysis within his forensic parole psychological evaluations were responsible for actually preventing the scheduled parole of at least 19 heinous child sexual offenders back into the community. John, so glad to have you on Washington Watch.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So Drag Queen Story Hour is a bit of a social phenomenon, and what we used to think were individual and sort of grassroots, uncoordinated efforts to get drag queens into public venues has actually revealed itself to be a very coordinated effort through a national organization that began in San Francisco a few years ago. So we've talked about the foolishness of these drag queen story hours at libraries, public schools, but we have not yet delved into the notion that this is a grooming program. And here's why I think this is important, particularly for the parents who are going to be listening to this. As the Christian Post reported, parents in Texas have discovered that David Lee Richardson, who was participating in these story hour events for the Austin Public Library System over a past year, has a criminal record for prostitution. His drag queen name is Miss Kitty Litter. But an actual criminal record for prostitution and a year-long history with the Austin Public Library. Are you surprised that this individual is a sexual predator?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, there's been others that Mass Resistance has uncovered that are actual have offenses for child sex offending. So there's clearly predators, and I am so pleased to have you and others now really trying to alert parents to what's going on. I'm probably like the average parent. Once upon a time, I didn't know, because we don't think like that. That's
Sure.
probably from my years in prison. When people ask me about predators, how to begin to profile them, see, on the one hand, it's very difficult because by the time somebody becomes a predator, the last thing they're going to do is let you know they're a predator. And that's very important to know. Predators don't announce themselves because that would be a little self-defeating.
Sure.
However, by the time somebody becomes a predator, they have gone through very, very, in my mind and what I've plotted out, very predictable stages of deviance. For those that are come from biblical perspective and those that are familiar with that, Romans chapter 1 describes a downward progression that becomes very permanent. We as Christians like to believe that no one is beyond redemption, no one is beyond hope. But unfortunately, we have, we give mental assent to the authority of Scripture. But when it comes to asking, well, what does that mean when someone is given over to a reprobate mind? What does that mean?
Right.
And are they able to come back? Is there a point of no return? And if someone really reads Romans chapter 1, they will see that there is a point at which, just like Pharaoh hardened his heart and God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Yes,
There's a point at which, right? There's a point at which someone can get, and science now, a number of good folks have looked at brains of psychopaths, and discovered, and you can Google this online, a simple Google search of brains of psychopaths, and you'll see the color imaging of psychopaths' brains, and you will see that two things are true. They don't operate in a normal fashion, and they never will. They are forever changed. Robert Hare of the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, I'm certified in that. Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania flew him out, and a number of us were hand-selected to be a part of that training. And as I was in that training, it was heartening to know that I didn't learn a lot in this sense, that I had really dug deep, having started the nation's first intensive treatment program in solitary confinement. I was studying deeply. I wanted to know. I had to know, because having worked with survivors, I had to know how and why somebody did what they did.
John, I'm so glad we have you for another segment because we have only started to scratch the surface on this. John Euler, licensed professional counselor, talking about what these drag queen story hours really are. Not entertainment, not the arts, not education or literacy, but grooming. We'll be right back after this break on Washington Watch. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Sarah Perry, sitting in for Tony Perkins. And we're here with John Euler, a licensed professional counselor who has unique experience giving advice, providing therapeutic services, developing programs in the field of sexual crimes and with sexual predators. So no one understands this issue better, and really what is at the heart of the issue of seemingly innocuous, often publicized drag queen story hours than John. So, John, do you think, we've talked a little bit about sort of the sexual deviancy of the way the mind operates and how these individuals are given over to a certain way of thinking that is ultimately reprobate. I have to believe pornography has something to do with this.
100%. And I want people to understand that underneath all of sexual deviance, 100% of it is porn. Now, once upon a time, there was no porn, but there's always been sexual deviance. But in the year 2019, you can be rest assured that 100% of deviant men are accessing porn online. Most men, unfortunately, are accessing porn online. But you shall know them by their fruits, and you can look at somebody, if they're acting deviant, guess what? So what I want parents to understand is any man, drag queen, any man that would put on women's underwear, sorry to be graphic, and then put on a dress, we call that drag, A, is not your average guy. B, he didn't come up with that on his own. and see he's been saturating his mind in porn. That's the reality. Now, having worked with predators of all sorts, the one thing I never would have guessed is this, that 100% of them, and they have floated myths out there. We've heard that they're sexually abused. The sophisticated ones are not sexually abused. That's a myth they put out there. How can I define that? You can go onto SurvivorSupport.net, my website, or my Twitter page, and I help people understand that. But in a nutshell, if you've been sexually abused, you will not turn around and abuse others. You are hypervigilant. Now, we understand child-on-child offenses, but what you will see is this. You will see a natural progression of difficulty through junior high, high school years. You will see a paper trail on that child. For an adult to get into adulthood that's well-adjusted and no criminal history or no significant psychiatric history, now we're talking the majority of drag queens, you're talking about someone that has not been sexually abused. How do you know? Because they give no signs. A survivor has very distinctive characteristics. These men don't have those characteristics. They try to mirror that at times, but intuitively they don't have that. Working in the prison with these guys, come to find out that once their mind turns, they hunger and thirst after offending. That's where their mind's at, and therefore they plan. And what they decided, what they discovered, it's easy for me to see it now, is they decided to float a trial balloon for two reasons. One, to see how easily they could access kids and pull pull the wool over parents' eyes. And two, and this is the most crucial thing, civic leaders need to understand this. If you think these guys are just going into libraries to read, no, they're grooming kids. But there's something larger. Now, do I know definitively? No, but everything within me says this. They're checking out the community. Because if the community doesn't protect their kids, guess what's going to happen? And where are they going to go? They'll go into all sorts of venues, all sorts of employment, job-related, employment, where they can access kids. The vast majority of them communicate with each other.
So it's the perfect testing ground.
There you go. You want to increase the number of sex offenders in your community, you welcome Drag Queen Story Hour. What is that, homophobic? Not at all. The first website I put together was churchprotect.org. That's my greatest concern. The greatest deviant mind are those that are religiously oriented predators, because they fool churches. They will target churches. So this is not a lifestyle focus of mine. The drag queens and others will say I'm phobic, and I'm not at all. I'm all about child protection. And if you go on the website at churchprotect.org or SurvivorSupport.net or my Twitter page, you will see I have a very easy assessment tool that can begin to help you understand. And parents can begin to ask these performers. It's very, very simple. It's two things. Will you fully identify will you give us your identification? And you reveal who you are, reveal your identity. And will you condemn, and I've got some pictures on my site, and they're very telling, but they were taken at different events. Men that are naked with young boys. And will you condemn a man for getting naked with another person's child? And
graphic but necessary questions.
That's right. So any parent that takes a child to an event like Drag Queen Story Hour, you are tempting fate. There's a good chance, it's inevitable, that predators are right there masquerading.
Thank John Euler through his Twitter feed, on his website, because this is an individual with unique experience in the field of clinical psychology, and specifically as relates to these individuals masquerading as artists, but truly, in many instances, sexual predators and deviants. I encourage you all to also speak to your decision makers across the county, in the country, in your state, commissioners, supervisors, those that hold the checkbook, and make some noise. You're listening to Washington Watch.